About 10 years ago, I took steps to take my own life. Suicide prevention is very personal to me. Suicide as a response to stress is not normal. Unfortunately, to people who are in this mental state, it is the answer. Remember, they are in so much distress, so much emotional pain, that all they want is things to stop. And suicide can be prevented by talking about mental health and by talking about suicide. So the path to suicide is not straight, but it starts, as we saw, with the ideation, the actual idea.
I'm Vivian Boaz, and this is the EHS Unplugged podcast, the show where we share tips on home and workplace safety, environmental sustainability, and health and wellness tips. Join us as we explore these topics with industry experts and learn to create a safer and healthier world.
Our mission is to raise awareness about OSH and to ensure that even the most remote and underserved communities have access to vital safety information. The topic that we'll be handling today is suicide prevention, a positive approach to understanding suicide causation and prevention. And today we'll be joined by one and only Rosie Russell from IIRSM, and in full, that is the International Institute of Risk and Safety Management. I will wish to welcome her so that now we can start over the session. So Rosie, welcome, and you may pick over.
Thank you very much, and thank you for that lovely introduction. And it's an absolute privilege to be here with you today on the EHS Unplugged podcast. Myself and Vivian first connected via LinkedIn, and I'm really happy to be here today and collaborate with the EHS Unplugged podcast. I'm going to share my screen now so you can see the slides that I have. So, as Lumiti said, our topic for today is suicide causation and prevention. I am Rosie Russell. I'm currently the president of the International Institute of Risk and Safety Management. I'm also the director of Environment, Health, Safety and Sustainability at Mira GTX. We are a gene therapy company. Through my wider work, I'm also currently working with the British Standards Institute on a guidance standard for suicide prevention. Now, this is being done through the British Standards Institute, but it is by no means intended to be British only. It is intended to be a worldwide guide. The QR code that is there at the top right hand of your screen, if you scan that with your camera, you will be able to register your interest in the new suicide prevention standard. And when it goes out to public consultation, you will receive a copy. So to start with the main presentation, quite simply, I should not be here. About 10 years ago, I took steps to take my own life. I'm very happy to say that people intervened and that I survived. But please know that suicide prevention is very personal to me. And every year around the world, about 200 million people have thoughts of taking their life through suicide. I made a common error just there. We do not talk about committing suicide anymore because we commit a crime, and suicide was seen as a crime. So we talk about people taking their own lives or dying by suicide. But every year, 200 million people have suicidal thoughts. About 56 million people will then go on to start to plan how they are going to take their own lives by suicide. And that translates into about 20 million suicide attempts every year. Every 1.5 seconds, somewhere around the world, somebody is attempting to take their own life. 800,000 people die by suicide every year, 1 every 40 seconds. 1 in 7 suicides, 1 in 7 deaths by suicide have a work-related element to it. So that's 1 every 10 seconds. Someone is trying to take their own life as a result of something from work contributing to their mental state. And thoughts of suicide, they are very much an equal opportunity issue. Anyone can have thoughts of taking their life by suicide. It's about 20% of the global population will have such thoughts at some point during their lifetime. So if we're going to talk about suicide, we need to talk a little bit about mental health first. And for most people, we will go through our lives and our mental health will generally be good. It will exist in this normal range. We're at the top here where things are 10 out of 10. You're probably doing something that you actively enjoy right now. I've got cuddling a fluffy kitten, but you may have other things that you would prefer to be doing. At 9, we're maybe a little frustrated or disappointed, but you're easily distracted and cheered up with a little effort. Maybe you're a little busier than normal or a little bit tired, but it's not a big deal. It's just normal. And down at 8, things are actually bothering you, but you are coping. As I say, you could be overtired, hungry. It's the emotional equivalent of a headache. If you look after yourself, this will pass. So for most people, this is where people will live their lives. However, if things get worse, we drop down to 7. And this is, for most people, a bad day or a few bad days. You've still got the skills to get through it, but be gentle with yourself. Take some time out. Use some self-care strategies. You'll know what they are for you. What is it that you need to do? Maybe go and spend some time with family or friends. Maybe have a bath, read a book. But if we don't manage to recover from 7, we'll drop down to 6. And here, your mental health is starting to impact on your everyday life. Easy things are becoming difficult. You're struggling perhaps to get out of bed or go and pay those bills. Perhaps you're procrastinating at work. Things are now starting to become quite difficult for you. This is the time at which you should speak to a doctor. And at 5, well, you just can't do things the way you would usually do them. Your mental health is resulting in impulsive and compulsive thoughts, and this may be hard to cope with. So where things were difficult before, you are probably starting to rationalize what you do. And then we get down into severe mental health. Because at 4, you're actively avoiding things that are making you more distressed. The problem is that will make it worse. If it's ignoring the bill that needs paid or the jobs that you need done around the house, perhaps going to see somebody you need to see or things at work. At 4, this is really getting very serious. And by the time you get down to 3, you can't hide this anymore. You're probably having issues sleeping, eating, fun, socializing. Work, study is difficult. Just Nothing is normal. It's like walking through mud. Everything is difficult. But more to the point, at 3, other people start to notice. And I think that's notable because we saw that earlier on, there was a prompt to say you should be speaking to your doctor. So other people will only notice that your mental health has got severe after you should have spoken to your doctor. That means if this is somebody you know and you are noticing that they are struggling, they are in immediate need of help. But you might ask yourself, why haven't they asked me for help? Why haven't they reached out? And the simple answer is, at this point, they can't. At this point, they cannot reach out. They... Hello? So at this point, you cannot reach out. You don't feel worthy of help. It's actually incumbent on those who are able to help to reach in at this point. By the time we get down to 2, you really are struggling. Impulsive and compulsive thoughts, they're repetitive, they are taking up a lot of space in your brain. Your mind is just full of noise. And at 1, this is as bad as it gets. This is the worst mental and emotional distress possible. You can no longer care for yourself. You can't imagine anything getting worse. And you want the pain to stop. This is the point where somebody is in an immediate crisis and they are at risk of taking their own life. Because bear in mind, the motivation here is to make the pain stop. So how does somebody get to this state? Well, it can start with a feeling of being alone. One of the things that we need as humans is a feeling of belonging, feeling that we're part of a group. And if we lose that, we start to feel lonely. And we will not engage in perhaps some of the support that would be available. If we then add to that somebody feels that they are a burden, that they are not only not contributing, but they're actually taking resources from other people, we get this trigger of a desire for suicide. This is where the thoughts of, I want to die, come from. I am alone, I do not belong, I am causing other people's problems. But that itself is not enough for somebody to go and take their own life. We actually need to then add in this capability for suicide. It turns out not everybody in the population is actually capable of taking their own lives. But where this intersection between this capability, this feeling of being alone and feeling of being a burden cross over, we find that people will attempt to take their own lives, and in some case they will complete their suicide. This bit is important though. Suicide as a response to stress is not normal. This is an over-the-top response to where somebody is at. It is not rational. And it is not rational because their mental state is not that of a rational person at this moment in time. You will have no doubt heard people say that suicide is not the answer. Well, unfortunately, to people who are in this mental state, it is the answer. Remember, they are in so much distress, so much emotional pain, that all they want is things to stop. And this is an area where we can help. We can keep people safe. And there are a number of risk factors for suicidal behaviors, these risk-taking behaviors that can result in someone taking their own life. And believe it or not, the top one is someone talking about taking their own life. This isn't a cry for help. This isn't attention seeking. Remember, suicide as a response to stress is not normal. Somebody in their own mind who is normal and in the right frame of mind, they are not going to talk about ending their life. There is something deeply wrong if somebody goes as far as disclosing that to you. If you know that the individual has attempted to end their life before, that's another big risk factor. That tells you that this person is capable of taking their own life. Also, self-harm. Now, there's an asterisk there. Self-harm itself is not considered a suicidal behavior. Self-harm for many people who engage in this, it is a way of coping with their emotional pain through physical pain. This may be hard for us to understand, but self-harm is a risk for someone taking their own life by suicide, because sometimes the measures that they engage in around self-harm go too far. Depression, substance misuse, mental health conditions, these all increase the risk of suicidal behaviors. Chronic pain and illness, where someone has dealt with a chronic illness for many years, again, they may just wish the pain to stop. This especially is a risk in the elderly, where perhaps they're not being cared for as well, or they've just had enough. Where there is a family history of mental health conditions, suicide or substance misuse, this puts those other family members at a higher risk of suicide. A history of trauma, whether that be abuse at home, at work, in the community, experiences of war or being displaced, having to seek asylum in another country. This is also a strong risk factor for suicidal behavior. And 8 might sound strange, but exposure to somebody else's suicide is itself a risk factor. Redundancy or financial issues, that feeling that you are now a burden, you can no longer provide. And then marginalized communities. And that includes groups such as LGBT or people who are neurodiverse. In fact, a recent study done by Professor Baron Cohen in the UK, his research group showed that people on the autism spectrum are 11 times more likely than the general population to attempt to take their own life. So the path to suicide is not straight, but it starts, as we saw, with the ideation, the actual idea that someone may want to end their life. It then goes on to intent, so somebody starts to make a plan. Now, this is key, because if someone discloses to you that they have thoughts of taking their own life, your first question should be, have you planned how to do this? Because if they have, they are one step further along this path. They develop their plan. They collect together what's needed to execute the plan. They may then put preparations in place. Someone who's been very depressed, who suddenly seems a lot more calm, yet they appear to be putting their affairs in order, maybe giving away things that are special to them, making sure you know where their will is, and things like that. That's a real red flag. Because if they seem more calm, they've accepted that the end is near for them. They then ultimately make that decision to take their life and act on that. But we can see there are many steps on the path to suicide where we might be given an opportunity to intervene. And I say might because some people looking to end their lives can be so secretive that we will never know. So one of the things we should never do if we lose somebody in our community to suicide, we should never blame ourselves because we may not have known just how bad they were. So that's a summary of the mental state of people and how they get to the point of wishing to take their own lives. But more importantly, how do we prevent that? Well, how often do you ask people in your community how they are? I certainly know in the UK, it's a very British thing to greet somebody with "Good morning, how are you?" And the usual response is, "Yes, I'm fine, thank you very much." It's a platitude. It's a greeting. There is no substance to that. But the number of times that someone has said to me, "I'm fine, thank you," and something in my mind said, that didn't sound right. I've asked a second time. And that's where we start to get to the truth. Because I say, "No, really, how are you?" And they look at me and said, "Well, I just said I'm fine." You might get a little bit of a frustrated response there. But I turned around and said, "Yes, but your initial answer didn't sound like you. It sounds like there's something bothering you." Now, most of the time when I say that, they go, "Thank you for asking. It's just been a difficult morning. My child wouldn't get up, or, my husband's shirt wasn't ironed, or the car wouldn't start, or many other reasons why somebody might just be a little under the weather that day." And they probably appreciate you asking. Maybe you go for a cup of tea, have a chat. But equally, there have been times when I've said, "How are you really?" And I've seen their shoulders slump, then look at the ground, take a deep breath and sigh. This is more than just being a little bit frustrated with life. This is someone who potentially is suffering with their mental health. And this is the point where those three words, "How are you?" could be the difference between someone starting on their recovery or feeling that nobody cares because nobody actually asked how they were and meant it. So just engaging with your community and honestly asking people how they are can be a key to preventing suicide. Engaging with people who are struggling and supporting them and making sure that they belong, that they're not a burden, that can really help. However, if there has been a suicide in your community, we need to talk about post-vention. how to prevent another suicide. Because you'll have seen earlier on, exposure to another's suicide is a risk factor for that individual themselves taking their own life. Between 130 and 165 people will be affected by a suicide. And if you think about that, that is a person's social group at work, at home, and in the community. About 10 to 15 of those, however, will be so profoundly affected that will be at risk of taking their own lives. They may be blaming themselves for not getting involved, for not realizing that that person was so unwell. So when there is a death by suicide in your community group, there are 10 to 15 people who are now immediately at risk and a larger group who need support. So you need to be able to implement a response plan. That's great, Rosie. Yeah, you ask, what is this response plan? Well, in the workplace, there should be a written plan as to what to do were someone to die by suicide. The first thing that the organization should do is acknowledge that this has happened. A simple communication can go out that says, we acknowledge that this person has died, and we will be doing something to help support everybody affected by this. We don't need to say how they died. In fact, it's better not to. But to actually acknowledge that someone did die validates how people may be feeling. From there, every manager from the top down should be speaking to their staff and asking how people are feeling. And that might be profoundly difficult for a manager. But at this point, a manager needs to be there for their people. Now, that manager might be hurting themselves, and hopefully their manager and other people in the organization will be able to help. But this needs to be proceduralized from the top of the company, that every manager speaks to every person in the organization. And with that, we should be pointing everybody that we know to appropriate services where people can help. And openly talking about people's mental health, because this is how we stop someone else taking their own life. And this can happen. There is a fairly famous case in France Telecom where there was a cluster of suicides. One person taking their own life triggered several others. And it was due to the toxic working environment in and around that department and wider in that company. And had the company stopped and acknowledged what was going on, it's possible that some of those deaths could have been prevented. So this is my perspective, my personal perspective. Suicide is not inevitable. If we can make sure that people feel that they belong, whoever they are, if we can make people feel that they contribute, then suicidal ideation is less likely. And suicide can be prevented by talking about mental health and by talking about suicide. So long as this is a difficult or taboo subject for people, suicide will happen, and it will happen somewhere hidden in the dark. But a suicidal individual can be kept safe. If you have someone who has said that they have intent to take their own life, we can rally around that person and keep them safe. We can get the appropriate medical help they might need. we can get support. We can perhaps remove the means of taking their own life. But this for me is the most important. A suicidal individual can recover. I am myself testament to that. Reintegration into life and work after an attempt is possible. But also intervention after suicide in the workplace or community is absolutely key so that we support those affected and we prevent another person dying by suicide. So we can reduce harm and save lives. Thank you very much for listening. And thank you to the help that I had from Leda Medrano for designing my slides. I will leave this slide up just for a moment. Again, if you are interested in knowing what the British Standard Institute is doing around suicide prevention, please do register and get involved in the public consultation.
Thank you so much, Rosie, for taking time off your busy schedule. I know how busy you are to put together such an informative and impactful presentation for everyone who's been able to attend this webinar. Luniti, thank you so much for moderating this session beautifully. You've done a very good job. So thank you very much. To the audience, I am from across the world. I've been checking the people in attendance, and it's not just a Kenyan affair anymore. I've seen people from the UK. I've seen somebody from the UAE. So that's really impressive. Thank you so much for the support. We don't take it for granted. Now, I would also like to acknowledge the presence of representatives from the Kenya Ministry of Labour, specifically DOSH, who've also joined us today. Thank you so much for supporting EHS Unplugged podcast. I would also like to acknowledge the Workplace Safety Professionals Association. Mariaka is here. He's been a very good partner. The association has been a very good partner in supporting OSH initiatives in the country. And I've also seen our former chair, David Ongesa, is also here. Thank you so much, guys, for supporting.